What is going on, everybody? What is going on? The Catch fam, my name is John Dawson, and in today's video, we are hopping into our waiver wire must-adds for Week 14, the 2022 fantasy football season. If you guys do enjoy today's content, be sure to hit that like button on the way in. Hit that subscribe button, of course, if you are new to the channel. And please feel free to drop any comments, questions, concerns pertaining to the 2022 fantasy football season down below. I'll get back to you as soon as I possibly can. Without further ado, let's hop into today's video. All right, first on the list, we've got Cam Akers of the Rams. And I get it, guys. There's probably a lot of you guys who feel very cautious with adding Cam Akers, who's 55% rostered at the moment. In week 12, we saw Kyron Williams be the lead back for his backfield. Is a favorable matchup for both running backs going into week 13. And going into week 13, we talked about Kyron Williams. There's a lot of back and forth here with this Sean McVay-led backfield. But at the end of the day, Cam Akers really made the most of his opportunities against the Seattle Seahawks in week 13. He had 2 rushing touchdowns, 60 yards on the ground, and 17 total touches on the ground, 19 fantasy points in full PPR. I really want to say that the Rams are going to ride the hot hand here and roll with Cam Akers as the lead back. But don't get me wrong, this could go any way when it comes to this offense. But let's face it, the Rams showed a little bit of life offensively in week 13 against the Seahawks. They get the Las Vegas Raiders in week 14 and the Green Bay Packers in week 15. Both of these units have played very poorly against the run, and we've talked about this in the past couple of weeks. The Rams will face the Chargers in week 17 in the fantasy championship, a very favorable matchup overall. So while week 16 is a little bit weaker against the Denver Broncos, whoever looks like the lead back for the Rams, we want to own as we approach the fantasy playoffs with a lot of favorable matchups coming up. So at the moment, I'm going to roll with Cam Akers as a must-add player, even if he's on your bench, just to kind of see how things shape out. But if we can work off of week 13 where he looked very good, he should have some upcoming productive days as we approach week 14. All right, Donovan Knight was one of the most added players in fantasy football moving into week 13 against the Minnesota Vikings, but he still sits at just 55% rostered overall according to the Sleeper app. He had 16.8 fantasy points in full PPR in week 13 against the Minnesota Vikings. Will face the Buffalo Bills in week 14, who looked better this past week against the run than they had in the few weeks before that, dealing with some injuries. But overall, even if Michael Carter is healthy and able to play in week 14, we know that the Jets are a run-first football team. That is their bread and butter, even with the emergence of Mike White at the quarterback position. So I still think Knight can carve out a nice role within this offense. We've got an extremely favorable strength of schedule. We got the Bills in week 14, a little tough. We've got the Lions, the Jacksonville Jaguars, and the Seattle Seahawks in the coming weeks after that, a very good strength of schedule. So even if Knight is a pure handcuff, even if he is an RB2 in a committee-led backfield, he has fantasy value just looking at his playoff schedule alone. And I absolutely think he should be rostered as we approach week 14. All right, next up on the list, we've got James Cook of the Buffalo Bills. He will face the Jets in week 14. Not the best matchup on paper, but also not the worst. His brother, Dalvin Cook, just had a pretty good day on the ground against the Jets in week 13. But looking at James Cook, he is 31% rostered according to the Sleeper app. He had 16.5 fantasy points in week 13 in a tough matchup against the New England Patriots, and he looked like the lead back, although he only had 1 more touch than Devin Singletary. He had 6 targets and 6 receptions, had a lot of receiving work, 41 receiving yards for Cook in week 13. So once again, you're probably going to get a committee here, but even if Cook is just a pure handcuff, we are at that point in the fantasy season where we're looking for pure running back handcuffs as we approach the playoffs. After he gets the Jets in week 14, he'll have the Miami Dolphins, the Chicago Bears, and a little bit of a tougher matchup in week 17 against the Cincinnati Bengals. But overall, a pretty favorable strength of schedule. And let's face it, he's on one of the best offenses in the league. So we want pieces of this Bills team when we find the players that are productive. Cook has looked better as of late. He had his best fantasy day in week 13. I say he's a player who's at least worth riding your bench as we approach week 14. And our last running back, speaking of handcuffs that we are searching for as we approach the end of the season, let's talk about Jordan Mason, who had 8 touches against the Miami Dolphins for 51 rushing yards. Listen, he really only got involved towards the end of the game, but handcuffing a running back like Christian McCaffrey, who has a history of injuries, is absolutely worth doing so. A kind of back and forth schedule to finish the year. In week 14, a tough matchup against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, but week 15, a favorable matchup against the Seahawks. Tough matchup in week 16 against Washington, then a very favorable matchup against the Raiders in the fantasy championship. So listen, at the end of the day, we know that Kyle Shanahan likes to use more than one running back. We know that Eli Mitchell is out. The big question coming into week 13 was, are we going to see Jordan Mason, TDP, or Telvin Coleman get the most touches? Well, at the end of the day, it was Jordan Mason. 8 touches, 51 yards on the ground. I think as the weeks continue to go, he'll only get more and more touches, but I'm always cautious when it comes to a Kyle Shanahan backfield. Don't be surprised if he gets Shanahan, but I think that Mason is a valuable handcuff who could start to see some work as we begin to wrap up the end of the fantasy season. Moving on to the wide receiver position, let's talk about DJ CHARK, 26% rostered at the moment. We talked about CHARK going into week 13. He finished with 14.8 fantasy points and full PPR. 6 targets, 5 receptions, 98 receiving yards. A nice day for CHARK, who will face the Minnesota Vikings in week 14 before facing the Jets, the Panthers, and the Bears. A pretty favorable overall strength of schedule for a Lions team that really, regardless of a potential playoff spot or not, they are going to try and play their best football on a weekly basis. This is a team that is not giving up towards the end of the season. And let's face it, the Lions looked really good against the Jacksonville Jaguars in week 13. So I think that DJ CHARK, who was very good to start the year before dealing with an injury, will only see more production as the weeks continue to go on. So I like DJ CHARK. I don't think there's a ton of upside because you've got a team that really likes to run the football with the Lions, and you've got a lot of receiving options. But we did see Amon-Ra St. Brown, kind of get banged up once or twice in this game, although he was able to play through it. We've seen this receiving core get injured more than once, kind of across the board throughout the season. So I think that DJ CHARK definitely holds some nice value. And while we're talking about the Lions receivers, keep an eye on Jameson Williams, right? I told you guys, do not risk starting him going into week 13. He's going to be eased into things, but he's 59% rostered at the moment. He might be worth a stash as well. I know a lot of you guys out there were asking about him going into week 13. I know a lot of the fantasy community was talking about Jameson Williams after he was activated from IR. Do I think he's worth a roster spot? Sure, but I wouldn't start him until we see a productive pattern emerge. All right, next up on the list, we've got NICO Collins, who sits at 40% rostered, which is kind of surprising for me because I've had a lot of you guys ask me questions about potentially starting NICO Collins, who had 12.5 fantasy points in week 13 against the Browns, 10 targets, just 3 receptions, but 35 receiving yards, and he scored a touchdown. So since week 10 of the season, he's had 9.8 or more fantasy points in full PPR. A tough matchup against the Cowboys, since he will probably be lining up as the wide receiver 1, as it does not look like Brandon Cooks is going to be healthy anytime soon. But after that, he gets the Kansas City Chiefs, the Tennessee Titans, and the Jacksonville Jaguars to finish out the fantasy season. A very favorable strength of schedule for NICO Collins after next week against the Cowboys. So I think that Collins, especially in full PPR, is a player we can rely on in the flex, who should absolutely be rostered as we approach week 14. All right, next up on the list, we've got Trent Sherfield of the Miami Dolphins, just 2% rostered at the moment. Really a name we haven't talked about at all throughout the fantasy season, although it's worth noting he did have 16.3 fantasy points in week 10 against the Browns. But the main reason we want to take a look at Sherfield, who I will add I think is extremely risky, is because Jalen Waddle, played through a leg injury against the Niners in week 13. But if Waddle, finishes the week as questionable and potentially sits out in week 14 against the Chargers, then Sherfield will more than likely be the wide receiver 2 for the Dolphins. This is one of the most explosive offenses in the league, so he should automatically gain value. 13.5 fantasy points for Sherfield in week 13. 3 targets, but just 1 major reception for 75 receiving yards and a touchdown. So I still think Sherfield holds a lot of risk, a big boomer bust player, even if Waddle does not play, but definitely a player that we can consider in the flex since he's tied to the Miami Dolphins offense as we approach week 14. All right, let's talk about Isaiah McKenzie, who's 40% rostered at the moment, just 9.4 PPR points in week 13. Not the best performance, not the worst, but when we look at the last 2 weeks, McKenzie has at least 5 targets in his last 2 games. 9.4 fantasy points, like we said, in week 13, 22.3 in week 12 against the Detroit Lions. So when we look at Gabe Davis, for example, who had 9.5 fantasy points in week 13 and 7.8 in week 12, who's 93% rostered, I think you can definitely make the argument that Isaiah McKenzie deserves to be rostered in more leagues, especially full PPR leagues, especially those of you guys in 14-team or higher leagues. I think McKenzie is worth a flex. When we went over James Cook, we kind of talked about wanting pieces of this Bills offense to finish out the year. Some good competitive game scripts and matchups coming up against the Jets, the Dolphins, the Bears, and the Bengals to finish the fantasy season. I think McKenzie still holds a lot of boomer bust value like Gabe Davis. I think he holds some risk, but ultimately still a player we should consider as we approach week 14. All right, I told you guys last week I wasn't talking about Donovan Peoples-Jones in the waiver wire videos anymore, but I just can't help myself. He's 65% rostered at the moment. He had 13.4 fantasy points in week 13 against the Texans. A little bit of a tougher matchup against Cincinnati next week, but then he gets Baltimore, the Saints, and then Washington, a very favorable strength of schedule. And it looks like him and Deshaun Watson do have good chemistry. That was my biggest fear, that maybe the chemistry that he had with Jacoby Brissett would not be the same as chemistry with Deshaun Watson. But off of 3 targets, he had 3 receptions for 44 receiving yards. So he definitely has PPR value. Then on top of that, he scored the punt return for a touchdown as well. So at the end of the day, DPJ continues to be a dynamic player who deserves to be rostered. He's definitely rostered in more fantasy leagues than he was earlier in the season, but we've talked about DPJ literally every week since week 4, and I feel like at this point it just does not feel right if I don't mention him in the waiver wire video. So if you need a flex option, especially in PPR leagues, go check if DPJ is available in your league as we approach week 14. I had to throw at least one tight end on the video, so I'm going to roll with Greg Dulcich, who had 14.5 fantasy points in week 13 against the Ravens after finishing with 7 or less fantasy points in the previous 3 weeks. Listen, guys, the tight end position is an absolute mess at the moment. I had some wild questions moving into week 13 about the tight end position. I heard names I never even heard of when it came to your guys' potential starts for the tight end position. So I know it's rough, and ultimately the Broncos, who are not in offense I trust at all, have a favorable matchup against the Kansas City Chiefs defense in week 14. So if you're desperate for a tight end, I think you can add Greg Dulcich. He's 42% rostered at the moment. The other name I'd like to bring up is potentially Evan Ingram, who was really worried about with how inconsistent he had been in the previous 3 starts with 4.4 or less fantasy points, but he finished with 14 fantasy points in full PPR against the Lions in week 13. 5 receptions, 30 receiving yards, and a touchdown. He is a favorable matchup against the Tennessee Titans in week 14. So if you're desperate for a tight end, Greg Dulcich is 42% rostered. Evan Ingram is 48% rostered. They are probably your best bets, but gosh, it has gotten completely disastrous, completely ugly at the tight end position as we approach the end of the fantasy season. Okay, I'm going to give you guys 2 potential streaming options at the quarterback position. Jared Goff still sits at just 49% rostered according to the Sleeper app. He gets the Minnesota Vikings in week 14, who just gave up about 19 fantasy points to Mike White. So I like Goff, who just finished with 21.6 fantasy points against the Jaguars in week 13. He had 340 passing yards and 2 touchdowns. We look at the last 2 starts for Jared Goff, no turnovers, at least 17 fantasy points, 2 passing touchdowns in both these games. He had a really good performance against the Jaguars. So let's give Goff some props. I think he's definitely a quarterback we can stream against the Vikings as we approach the week. The other quarterback I want you to talk about is Tyler Huntley. As long as Lamar Jackson is not good to go in week 14, he scored the only touchdown in the entire game on Sunday against the Denver Broncos. So Jackson is definitely in a position with a knee injury where he is likely to miss some time. We look at what Tyler Huntley did last season. It was very up and down when he filled in for Lamar Jackson, but he definitely had some really good moments. 35.9 fantasy points in week 15 against Green Bay last season. The rest of his starts weren't that great, but at the end of the day, it's a good enough playoff schedule. It's a good enough remaining strength of schedule that if you're desperate for a quarterback, I really think Tyler Huntley could be an option. He gets Pittsburgh, Cleveland, Atlanta, and Pittsburgh again to finish the year. It's a really favorable strength of schedule. Some god-awful secondaries that he's going to be facing, and some teams that are just not good against the run, right? When we look at those three teams, right, you got TJ Watt, you got Myles Garrett. Outside of that, maybe AJ Terrell for the Falcons. But other than that, like, these are struggling defenses. So I think that Huntley, who's going to be in a position where the Ravens right now are #1 in that division, they're going to want to win these football games, no doubt about it. The pressure will be on. I think that Huntley can definitely make the most of this opportunity while Jackson is out. And regardless, 16.5 fantasy points against a good Broncos defense in week 13. It's not too shabby. And then on top of that, he gets the Pittsburgh Steelers in week 14. If you're desperate, I think Huntley is definitely an option as we approach the week. And that'll do it for today's video. If you guys did enjoy the content today, be sure to hit that like button on the way out. Hit that subscribe button. Of course, if you are new to the channel, it really does help us out. You guys hit that like and consider subscribing. And please feel free to drop any comments, questions, concerns pertaining to the 2022 fantasy football season down below. I'll get back to you as soon as I possibly can. With that, I'll say thank you guys so much for watching and or listening. And remember, you saw it here on The Catch.